All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today for this new webinar in our series, Money Matters. Today is all about advances, and we've got some great panelists here to talk about a variety of perspectives. We received a lot of questions in advance. Thank you for sending those. It helps inform the talk, and we'll get to as many specific questions as we can. Yeah, so today we've got, we're talking about advances against royalties, and as the Authors Guild, of course, we're here to help with contract reviews and other things like that. So if you're not a member, please visit authorsguild.org and check out what we do. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Erin Lowry, the author of the Broke Millennial series and a wonderful expert. Thanks for being here on this series with us, Erin. And I'll let Erin introduce our great panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. And hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be back. And as always, I'm incredibly excited about this one as an author myself. Advances are something I find deeply fascinating. And we have so much to cover today that I'm just going to hop right into introductions. So first up is Dara Hyde, is a senior agent at Hill Nada Literary Agency in Los Angeles. And she represents a wide range of fiction and nonfiction, including literary and genre fiction, memoir, graphic novels, middle grade, and young adult work. Before joining Hill Nada, Dara spent over a decade as an editor and rights permissions manager at independent publisher Grove Atlantic in New York. And Jonathan Lyons is a founding partner of Lyons Salke Law, LLP, a boutique media and entertainment law firm that provides counseling to clients in all areas of the media industry. And separately, Jonathan is also a literary agent and vice president at Curtis Brown. And we also have Amanda Shee, who is a content marketer and freelance editor who previously edited adult and children's nonfiction at Penguin Random House and Scholastic. So thank you all for being here today. I'm so excited to get started. And we're gonna start with a question for all of you, but Jonathan, I'm gonna have you kick off first with the answer. Do traditionally published authors always receive an advance?
Traditionally published authors, almost all the time they do, yes. You know, the advance size obviously varies depending on their track record or the specific book, but you know, I don't know the exact number, but I say at least 95% of the time they do when they're working with a traditional publisher. There's an exception to that, something which I think we'll talk about later, about where you can do a profit sharing model deal, where in lieu of an advance, you are basically just doing a profit sharing between yourself and the publisher, where you share all proceeds. You know, and there are obviously tiny, small publishers who pay little or no advance as well, but you know, that is definitely not the traditional route.
Now, Dara, have you ever experienced an example where one of your authors does not receive an advance who is traditionally published? I believe you're still on mute.
On the traditionally published side, I do represent some comic writers and artists, and some of those comic book deals have a very different back end and advance structure, and they do the profit sharing model. Although even then, I try to push for some money upfront or different ways to sort of guarantee that there will be some money on the back end. But traditionally published books, I agree with Jonathan. It's, you know, it tends to be at least 95, if not 99%, but the amount completely varies.
We'll get into that a little bit. I know people will be having lots of questions around that statement that just got made. And Amanda, you were kind of on the inside there for a long time. Did you ever once see a time where a traditionally published author that you worked with did not receive an advance?
Never in my experience, certainly not in-house. I think the only kind of minor experience I've had with it is more in my like freelance consulting, when I've talked to authors who are, as Jonathan mentioned, working with smaller publishers who would do profit sharing or might ask you to, you know, put up some money to get your book out there in the world.
Now, Dara, what exactly is an advance used for? So for instance, and this was something that got submitted, does an author need to pay for travel, for research, fact-checking, liability insurance, and marketing, or is it used for something else?
It depends on the book, and it depends on the advance, and it depends, you know, especially say with nonfiction is oftentimes sold off of a proposal. And oftentimes authors will set aside some of their advance specifically to help them finish research the book, or if there's travel involved in finishing a book, they will set aside part of their advance to, travel to finish doing the research. For fiction, it can really vary. And I think oftentimes that is a talk that I have with my clients about what they want to do with their advance, but it's also up to them with their personal finances. Do they look at this as a chance for them to maybe take some time off to be able to promote the book? Do they want to put some aside to do freelance marketing or publicity? Fact checking, it depends on the kind of book. Sometimes in a traditional house, they will be helping with fact checking or indexing. Sometimes that's up to the author, but it's something that's usually agreed upon during the deal stage. Sometimes there's photo research or photo permissions, or even permissions from within the book. If you quote lyrics, those are usually traditionally for the author to clear themselves. So sometimes they'll put aside some of that money to clear permissions. And so there's a variety of things. As far as liability assurance, usually with traditional publishers, they oftentimes will add you onto their liability insurance. And it's something I think Jonathan can talk about more, but it's usually not, it's for, you to be able to finish your book. And also to pay taxes, because this is not something that is taxed when you get it. And it's also not something that comes all at once. So sort of planning out what you're going to do and when you're going to get it, what fiscal year you might be getting it in, kind of thing.
Well, that sets up perfectly for Jonathan. Could you speak a little bit to the different structures that advances can get paid on? Is it one lump sum? Is it tiered out? What could that look like?
Sure. So things have changed quite a bit over the past 2 years, and even over the past 10 years compared to how it used to be. And I sound really old when I say that. It used to be you would see advances probably in two parts, right? Signing, you get a part of it on signing, ideally half, and then half on acceptance of the work. There's even a band that used to play in Frankfurt at the Frankfurt Book Fair called Half on Signature. And that was that's not the way it is anymore. So the band needs to change their name. Over time, publishers have tried to spread out those advance payments. And they each have their own kind of models or thresholds of when an advance gets to a certain amount, they want to spread it out even more. You can still, the lower the advance, you're more likely to still get a two-part payment, signing and acceptance, but the higher advance, it gets into thirds. And honestly, it's getting into fourths, fifths, and sixths now. In light of the pandemic, there were a couple publishers who issued new statements saying that if it was over this amount, they would just pay in sixths. It can always be negotiated to some degree. Or there's, even if it's the installment amounts, it's not even just how many installments, it's how much. Some publishers will say, well, we'll pay in 4 or 5 installments. Whatever installments, no matter what, we won't pay more than 50% of the total advance before acceptance. So they all have different variations to protect themselves. There's certainly room to negotiate that. From an author's advocate point of view, an author's point of view, you want as much upfront as possible. So whatever you can do to adjust that. There might be specific tax purposes to push some of it back. But yeah, you definitely aren't getting half on signing, half on acceptance anymore, unless it's a smaller deal.
So when thinking about it in sixths, what would be the trigger points for something if they're extending out that long? So in my experience, I've experienced, signing a third, acceptance a third, publishing date on the actual shelves a third. So at six, what are we using as triggers there for sending out some of that money?
Yeah, it gets crazy. So it's you get a part on signing, and then you get the ones I've seen is another part 3 to 6 months after signing. And then you can get a part based on delivery of progress materials, which is might be a part of the manuscript. You get another payment on acceptance. You get another payment on publication, and then another payment 12 months after publication. And I've even seen it payment 24 months after publication one time. Obviously you want to limit that as much as possible, but publishers are creative in coming up with all the different triggers, and it can be really problematic because, for instance, what happens if the publisher cancels without cause early? For whatever reason, they feel like the book isn't going to work anymore. Does the author get the rest of that money? It's something you have to negotiate. what if the publisher delays publication? Let's say they're going to pay on publication and they're supposed to publish within 18 months, but every publisher has a window to kind of delay it. Do you still get it within 18 months, or are you subject to the delay? You know, authors have to live lives, they're expecting this money. And so part of an agent or a lawyer's job is to make sure that those different installments have some kind of timing related to it as well, not just a specific event.
Now, on the topic of sales, publishing expectations, Amanda, is an advance based purely on the sales expectation, or is the genre that it's being published in a fairly strong factor there?
I think a lot goes into deciding what an advance will be. And I think in some ways, genre and sales expectation can be tied together. For example, in broad strokes, you could say like a picture book is probably going to have a smaller advance than like an adult business book. But there's other factors that contribute to that, right? So it's a question of kind of going back to what Dara was saying, like, are there going to be photos that need to be permissioned? Some of the publisher might pay for those. Is there going to be an illustrator? Do you need fact checking? How long is the book going to be? Is it hardcover or paperback? How much can you charge for the book? Children's books they sell for less than adult books, even like hardcover to hardcover. All of that feeds into what does it cost to even make the book to begin with? And then that contributes, in addition to sales expectations, to the total advance number.
Now, when the calculation of sales expectations is being run, how much of a factor are things like the author's social media presence or career status?
So in my experience for nonfiction, that's where like a social media following or career status would matter the most. But it's not even necessarily just, a number. It's how engaged are your followers. If you have followers, if it's like career status, then it's, are you already doing speaking engagements, things like that. If you sell a product, like how is your product selling? Basically, are people invested in you as an individual, so that once you say I have a book, they're going to want your book. I think from non-fiction, fiction, or any other kind of genre, it's a little bit more. It's less based on like your platform, unless it's kind of like a sweetener, I think, in more cases. And I think Dara and Jonathan, you might be able to speak to this as well. But in my experience, it's mostly your platform will apply to nonfiction.
I would agree that platform matters most in nonfiction. Sometimes it also matters in YA and children's and comics and graphic novels. But I think what they're looking at, in addition to all of the factors that Amanda said, is they're also looking sometimes for comparable titles. So when they're trying to figure out what the market could be for a particular book, they're sort of trying to figure out, well, where would it sit in a bookstore or alongside, like for readers of, how would someone come to this book? And if they feel like there's an easy offshoot to say, well, the readers who like this kind of book will also like this potential book, then the P&L, which is the profit and loss statement that they do to come up with the advance number, which is based on all of these different factors. Sometimes you're also putting in, where they think it might sit. And sometimes it's also, even if the author doesn't have a huge platform, is the book of a subject that might get a ton of attention, whether it's fiction or nonfiction? Is there a hook that is going to drive a lot of conversation? And that sometimes will also change their factoring into how they're going to put together an offer.
Just add to that. So agents try to kind of shape that conversation from the get-go, and the proposals, like agents have a whole marketing section where they include comparative titles, right? And it's like, if this and this, and then they look up the sales on these on BookScan, and even if it's a fiction pitch, you hear these kind of pithy this crossed with this type of thing. But like agents are kind of doing that to kind of shape the framework of how, if an editor is interested, what lens they might look at it in terms of sales. So those aren't wasted efforts that are being done at the proposal level or even in the agent's pitch. It's all part of that to kind of shape the conversation.
Well, Jonathan, that's a perfect segue into talking about the literary agent and their role in negotiating the terms for the advance. So one of the questions that came in is it the literary agent's role to negotiate for an advance? And if you do have a literary agent that's doing that for you, how does he or she get paid? So Jonathan and Dara, I'd love to hear your opinions on that.
You want to go first, Dara?
Sure. It is the job of the literary agent to negotiate, and that's one reason why you have them, is because they are thinking from the get-go about how they're going to pitch the book, who they're going to pitch the book to, how they're going to frame it. And then if an offer comes in and, you know, hopefully multiple offers, then you really need somebody who's going to be there talking you through what's in the offer. And I know we're going to get to it later, but the specific points of an offer are not just the advance. There's so much else to negotiate. And that's the part where, you know, your agent talks you through that and talks you through what the actual points mean. And that's also where the agent can figure out what kind of leverage they have. Is it something they can negotiate more on the advance, or are there other points of the deal where they can also try to sweeten it and make it a better deal? And also know what's out there in the market to know, is this a comparable advance? Is this a fair advance for this book in this marketplace at this particular moment? And if it's a competitive situation, things can change a bit, and you know, those numbers can sometimes go out the window just because you're in a competitive situation and people, you know, want something. They may change some of the parameters, but all of those factors are what the agent is looking to do.
And so I would just add, agents get paid when authors get paid. And so, you know, most, I don't want to go too far on this, but agents typically, in my opinion, shouldn't be charging a fee. They get paid a percentage of whatever the author's advances and whatever the author's royalties is, anything that the author gets paid under that agreement with the publisher. You know, the standard for commission for domestic deals is 15%. And most agencies prefer to have publishers pay the agency directly, the author's monies, and then they take out their commission and any approved expenses that might come up, and then remit the rest to the author. There are a few agencies that will do split payments, and they'll just instruct the publisher to pay the agent 15% and pay the author the rest. But most of the time, it flows through the agent. So 15% is the norm.
And part of the reason why most agents like it to flow through is so we can keep track that the publisher is paying the correct amount at the correct time, following the contract. It's one of the things that we really check, is to make sure that everything is flowing the way it should.
I would also just add, from like an in-house editor's perspective, an agent is your best buffer so that you and your editor have like a business art focused relationship, and hard conversations, if there need to be hard conversations, happen between your editor and your agent. I think it's very hard for an author to have to switch from craft talk to contract negotiation. So that just kind of keeps those relationships separate, and where directed in the right energies where they need to be.
That's so true. And also on the negotiation point, Dara, I'd love if you could get into some of the other deal points that are worth focusing on, other than just the advance. And in that, I just want to add on, I've seen a couple questions come in. I just want to, perhaps you'll get into this, perhaps we'll save it for a bit, but the idea of, should you negotiate no index if you have a nonfiction book and that labor doesn't really seem a price worth paying for? And what about like the publisher's marketing expenses that are happening in the background? Is that on the publisher? Is that coming out of your advance? Is that all up for negotiation in the initial conversation?
So the initial conversation, and I know that Jonathan wanted to get into this as well, with most traditional publishers, it is a deal memo. So they will do an offer and it will be in the form of a deal memo. And there is an advance, but there's literally like a page, sometimes two, of all of the other pieces of what they're proposing this deal would be. So there is the advance against royalties, but then there's also what those royalties will be. And they vary by format, and they vary, there's escalators. So the hardcover royalty might escalate once you sell a certain number of copies, the paperback, if there's mass market, ebook, audiobook, So there's all these different formats that the publisher is saying that they want to have. And then there's also territory. So are they asking for world rights, which means they can publish it in any language around the world? It means they would sell it for translation. Or do they just want North American? Do they just want world English? So territory is a huge thing to negotiate. And then if you are talking world rights, then what are the terms on what that translation deal would be? If they sell it to France to translate into French, what would that share be? So you're looking at all of those splits as well. And some of these in traditional publishing, there are sort of baselines that you're looking for, both with the royalties and with the royalty splits. And then there's also a different sub-rights. Are you talking about merchandising? Are you talking about media? Are you talking about, audio? Are you talking about podcasts? Are you talking about adaptations? There's so many different elements, because basically the idea for the main contract, the head contract, which we call it, is that it's an IP deal. You're saying, we're going to have the rights to this book, but then what's part of that book can really expand. And because I deal with children's and YA and graphic novels, there is a huge amount of what that can actually mean. So all of that is negotiated in the deal memo, including reversion terms. So what Jonathan had even said, who has the right to say this deal is going to actually fall apart, or we're going to cancel this book, or after a certain amount of time or a certain amount of sales, can there be a reversion clause put in there? So there's so many elements that come into that deal memo, and that's where we really negotiate. And sometimes it will come in for nonfiction indexing or permissions. That will be something that is discussed at that time. Sometimes they'll say it's TBD, like we'll discuss that later and it'll be negotiated. Sometimes they may not know, are we going to need an index or not? And it's something that can be discussed. Or permissions, sometimes they'll say, well, when we really get into it, let's look at it and see if we're going to have you pay up front, or are we going to take it out of future royalties? There's all these different elements that come into it. And usually you have an idea of what you're looking for when you go out with a book, because you know the material, you know the market, you know where you're going to. And also sometimes you know what different publishers structure these differently. And so if you're talking with a specific publisher, you know how they generally like to do this. And so you have an idea going in of what it would be like.
I would add to that too, all those things. It's like a ton of detail. And I found, and I suspect Gary agrees, the more you negotiate up front, the better. That's obviously when you have your most leverage, especially if you have multiple offers, right? Like if you have 3 or 4 publishers bidding and you're trying to sort out the final details and you haven't officially said yes, that's when you have the most leverage. Once you say yes and you get to the contract level, and then you start trying to negotiate things like some of the approvals and consults, like do you have approval over the narrator or the audio edition? Do you have approval over what subright? Some of these things, like, publishers oftentimes are reluctant to grant. You're going to be far more successful in negotiating those points up front when you have the leverage. Bonuses as well, like whether it's a bonus based on earnout, whether it's a bonus based on hitting the list, all these different things. Once you get to the contract level, you're often negotiating with a different person. The contracts professional, whether they're contracts manager or associate or even an attorney, and they're not really thinking of it in the framework of the deal and the context of the market and how the offer is and all those things. That's not really their job. It's the editor who really knows how much they want this book, and they're the ones who are going to be more likely to be willing to negotiate some of these bigger terms. The contracts people have to answer to, the bureaucracy of it all, and they have a whole different set of objectives.
And you brought up bonuses, which I think is really important too, because there's so many different kinds, and knowing what kind of bonus you're negotiating for, which can really help sweeten a deal. Some of them are more realistic to achieve than others. And that's something that you really think about when you're negotiating them. Is this a book that really is likely to earn out within the first year, or to hit a list, or to get an award, or to, there's bonuses based on format. There's bonuses based on time periods. There's bonus based on different bestseller lists or national bestseller lists. There's so many different kinds of bonuses that can help sweeten a deal. And as an agent, I'm always looking for a bonus that's actually achievable. There are certain books where it's very unlikely they may get, a #1 New York Times bestseller. So does that bonus mean anything? But maybe the bonus is actually they could earn out within a year. which would be a much more sort of realistic bonus to try to achieve. And is that bonus considered an additional advance, or is it actually just a bonus? And that's also another thing to look at.
Well, speaking of having that leverage with the contract before you officially say yes, on the back end, a question came in that can royalties be renegotiated? And the question is based on book is still selling well. It's been 11 years. Wondering if my contract can be adjusted for current rates. My first question is, I don't know that rates are better now than they were 11 years ago. You'd have to check on that. They might be better where you are right now. But that idea of can you actually renegotiate if your book continues to sell well?
Yeah, I mean, so there are things that agents and attorneys build into the contracts that allow for renegotiation. Typically around the ebook royalty, around the audio download royalty, the deep discount provision, which is a whole different conversation. But they're pretty nebulous, right? They're like, if the agency as a whole negotiates as a general matter a better royalty rate for this for all their clients, and it will automatically be applied here. Or they'll say if at least 3 of the 5 big publishers have agreed to, as a general matter, to change their royalty rate for ebooks, will apply here. And those are good and things to do, but I don't, they're tough to implement. There are ways to renegotiate royalty rates and even getting advances. Let's say, I think the most common one is, your client's book does really well and you're going back and you're selling, maybe let's say you did a $50,000 deal and the book sells like cupcakes. And so you're doing a new deal with them. And as part of that new deal, you say you're going to look back and do a refresher advance and maybe renegotiate some of the royalties on the previous deal. But you kind of have to have some moment to have leverage in order to negotiate that. So a new book that you're selling to them, that's one point. Way down the road, there's something called a copyright termination rights, but that's 35 to 40 years after publication, you can have a chance to kind of either terminate or renegotiate terms. But I think, there are some publishers who might renegotiate a rate out of the kindness of their heart. But unless you have something that you're bringing to the table as part of that renegotiation, like a new book, it's a little tough.
The only other thing I would add is sometimes if they're going to do a new edition, you can try to negotiate a bit. Like if it's been a very successful book and now they're going to do a 10th anniversary or a 20th anniversary, or maybe it was an adult book and now they're going to do a YA edition. Sometimes, like Jonathan said, you can go back in, but again, there's something there that is of leverage to sort of say, this book has done so well, it's an anniversary, we're going to add in a new afterword, that kind of thing. Then you can maybe go in and renegotiate some of it. But I also agree, Erin, that there are times when the terms from 15, 20 years ago may be more favorable. And part of it is figuring out what would be the best thing for that book. Is the best thing, just getting a new edition and new attention and new marketing? Maybe that's actually better than getting some money up front, is to get more attention on the book.
We've talked a lot about negotiating, and I'm sure more questions will come in, but I want to pivot for a second. And I know so many of us, especially as creatives, have a little bit of scarcity mindset, especially when it comes to money. So there's this inclination that as soon as there's an offer, just grab it. So are there actually instances where you just shouldn't negotiate on an advance and accept the first offer that comes your way? I know we need a moment to pause and think about that.
Rarely. I think that most editors, there are exceptions, like, very small houses, their offer is what it is. And that's what they can offer, and that's it. But, for most traditional publishers, I think editors are taking into account the fact that there will likely be a counter. Certainly with any of the major publishers, they're anticipating that, and they have an amount that they can pay and they have an amount that they're offering you. And they provide a cushion in anticipation of a negotiation. Again, to what degree you might be able to increase in advance or increase terms really depends on the nature of the work and how sought after it is. I think somebody had asked a question about auction, and there I mentioned it before, like a competitive bidding situation allows you to ask for quite a bit more. And it's, if you have multiple people offering, why not play out the market and see what you can get? you know, I almost think that not asking for more is almost like a sign of lack of confidence in your book. You should value your work highly, and you know, there's no harm in asking, just if you do it nicely.
I would agree with that. Even if I know if it's a very small publisher and I know this is all they can actually offer up front, I'll still ask for other things. I'll ask for sweeteners on the deal that will make it beneficial to the author, whether it's escalating the royalties at a different rate, which escalating the royalties basically means after you sell a certain number of copies, your royalty rate increases. And so the idea being that the more you sell, the higher share of each sale will go to the author. So there's elements of negotiation that are not just the advance, because there are times when, especially with a small publisher, they're like, this is all we have. I've given you, you go back to negotiate, you go back to counter, and they were like, this is the maximum I can possibly do up front. And I try to respect that, and then find other ways to make the deal better. Whether it's, I don't give them all the rights. Maybe they ask for world rights on an advance that's too small. So I'll say, you know what, I think that we need to have everything outside of North America or world English. So we need translation rights, or we need an escalator, or we need a bonus, or we need audio. Audio, yes. Although audio is becoming so difficult to get from a publisher. So there are different ways to negotiate. So I never just accept an offer, even small ones. I never just say, okay, that's good. There's always a way to make it better, but oftentimes it may not actually be the advance. Although I'm shocked sometimes when they're like, this is my offer. And I'm like, okay, what if you made the advance, a little bit bigger? And they say, okay. Like there are times when if you ask nicely and you do, as Jonathan said, they are sort of expecting a counter. And I would love, Amanda, your perspective on that from
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Like, I can confirm that I don't think I ever made an offer that I did not expect to negotiate in some way. Almost given that I came from Penguin Random House and Scholastic, obviously not tiny publishers. So there was almost always room on the advance, but even if there had not been, of course, we expect negotiation on multiple points after an initial offer. And my very first publisher that I ever worked for always said that if you don't ask, the answer is always no. So that is the advice that I would give creatives also, just ask.
I love that. I fully endorse that stance. Now, Amanda, I know we don't have many hard numbers on the percentage of authors who earn out their advances, but I do know one stat that is commonly quoted is 70% do not earn out their advances. I tried to vet that one. I'm not even entirely sure where it comes from, but you see that floating around in all sorts of articles. So regardless of what the number is, we do have a sense as an industry that a lot of people do not ever earn out. So what happens in that case if you as an author do not earn out your advance, particularly from a publisher's perspective?
Yeah, from a publisher's perspective, like immediate term, nothing terrible happens to you. You don't like lose your advance money or anything, because that advance is an investment in you by the publisher. So the publisher really just has not earned back their investment is really kind of the shorthand for that. Longer term, probably what could happen is if you have another project that you want to sell, it could be a little bit harder to sell that both with the publisher or with another publisher, depending on the sales record. Because now your editor has a sales track to bring to their acquisitions team, their publisher, their sales team to say, I want to do this next book, but if you haven't earned out, it's a little bit harder to make that argument from a financial perspective. I have seen it both ways, where authors then go to another house with that book that didn't earn out on the record, and if like the next book is very different or they just love it, it can still sell somewhere else. And I think even longer term, where we're talking about reversion of rights and things like that, if you get to a point where the book is no longer selling enough copies that it makes sense for the publisher to be printing it, they would put it on print and you could potentially get those rights back, and then you can do whatever you want with the project.
So
I just had one thing.
Oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
I just say something that some publishers do, which is to consider from a legal point of view is that if they say that the advance hasn't earned out, that in the book you want to revert the rights, they don't necessarily have to until you have earned out your advance. Most of the big publishers don't do that, but there are a few exceptions that you just have to ask for it to be struck. But the idea is like if it's out of print or if it's subject to reversion, yeah, the advance, whether or not the advance is earned out shouldn't come into play, but you will see that snuck into agreements every now and then, especially from smaller publishers. So just something to look out for.
Well, and for more clarity on the concept of reversion of rights, do you have to ask? Is it something that gets brought up to you? And at what point is that something you should be seriously considering?
I'd say, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it is up to oftentimes the agent and the author to start that conversation. A publisher isn't necessarily looking to revert rights. And you oftentimes have to, go back to the contract and see what the terms are for reversion and if they've been met. And sometimes it's a number of sales per sales cycle, or it's sometimes a number of years. There's so many different elements, and that is negotiated at the beginning of the contract. And so if it's been a long time, you may not totally remember what those reversion clauses were at that time. But there are different triggers that can help bring that about. And there are times when that really makes sense, but there's also times when asking for a reversion will remind a publisher that the book exists. And then they have the opportunity oftentimes in the contract to say, you know what, we're actually going to make sure this is back in print. So we will put it back in print within a certain number of months. So there are different elements. And sometimes a reversion of rights is what an author wants because they want to pursue it elsewhere. But if a book is still available, then and it hasn't earned out and it's, there isn't a new call for it somewhere, then what are you doing by asking for the rights back? It really depends.
And on the topic here of, modest, high advances, what are we looking for? The idea that so many people don't earn it out, both for Dara and for Jonathan. Do you want to push for the biggest, best advance you can get? Or do you want to play it a bit more modest, depending on whether or not you want to come back and write more and more? Because it sounds like, especially based on what Amanda said, it can be a little bit harder to get that next deal if you don't earn out the first time.
Yeah. Well, so I'd say, agents don't accept deals on behalf of authors without their approval, right? So, and without their significant input, agents guide the authors, but at the end of the day, it's the author's call. And I would say that there are some authors who feel daunted by receiving a really, really large advance. And I've had them kind of shy away from that, and because they're worried about, meeting their goals and the expectations and things like that. That said, I generally think that you should ask for as much money as possible. The single best way to get a publisher to commit to publishing your book in a vigorous and active way is having them put money on the line. And if they put a lot of money on the line to pay you, then they're more likely to do more from a marketing and promotional point of view to earn back that money they've paid. The other thing that you just can't control the market. I've had clients with beautiful, amazing books. We all know these books that sell like 20 copies. You never know what the market will bear. And so I just think that you get the most you can. And obviously within, there's other factors like the most you can with the editor you want, with the best terms you want, all the terms that Dara mentioned that go into it as well. But I don't think unless there's like a particular issue with the author, I don't think there's any reason not to try to get the most money.
And I would add on to that, I really want my clients to be published well. And that is there's an entire like sort of large view of what that means. And does that mean that they want to have a long career with a particular publisher and a particular editor, which you hope would happen? And sometimes that doesn't, because people move around and imprints change and things happen. And so sometimes you're looking at a long-term deal. Sometimes they would rather have maybe a 2-book deal because they feel like that gives them more security about earning out that first book if it's a really big advance. There are different ways. I have had some authors who sort of shied away from wanting too much. They really felt like they wanted to prove themselves and then continue to build. I've had some authors where it wasn't a choice. They started small and have continued to build. And then from there, because we've had success, each time they do something new, you're able to ask for more and look at that track record. And I do think that when you do have the leverage and when publisher is taking as much of a risk on the author as the author is taking, and they do want to have a positive experience. Everybody wants a book to earn out. It's the greatest thing. Like, it's really satisfying to have a book earn out. But it doesn't always happen, and there are different factors, and there's some publishers and editors who will really be cognizant of why a book might not have earned out. And sometimes it's some, natural disasters, things like COVID, things like 9/11, things like, there are things where some really huge, much bigger than publishing thing will have happened. Or let's say your book came out in November of 2016. Like, there are certain things where people, they're aware of maybe why a book that had really high expectations did not perform the way that they thought it could. And so there are times when a book may not earn out, but everyone knows it wasn't necessarily at the fault of the publisher or the author or the book itself. So it's not, that doesn't completely, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. People are sort of aware of sometimes why a book that had huge expectations didn't pan out. But then sometimes things just don't work. There's like weird timing, alignment of the stars, who knows? It's a very strange business. And then there's times when things work wildly beyond your expectations, and then you can go back for the next book and negotiate much more.
I know it's really hard to speak in firm numbers because, as we've reiterated, there is a multitude of factors. But is there a bare minimum that someone should expect to receive financially from an advance? Especially, I know for a lot of folks, the question was about more first-time novelists. Obviously, genre can really impact it. But is there any sort of bare minimum baseline we can give people where it's like, if it's not here,
I mean, so nonfiction's easier to do, right? Like, there is, again, so there's obviously smaller publishers, and you kind of, that is taking them out of the picture. If we're talking kind of larger or middle-sized publishers, there's kind of like a minimum amount that you typically see with nonfiction, which, is at a minimum $20,000, because the reality is that they need the money to write the book, right? And it's like, if they don't get that amount of money, the book's not happening. So that's the only one I feel really okay about, like, giving a range on. The rest, I'll leave to Darren and Amanda to comment.
It really varies. And I would say, because my client list is, straddles different types of publishing, whether it's children's graphic novels, small publishers, big publishers. I have had, very, very, very modest advances for certain books. We're talking, say, $1,500 for a memoir kind of thing. And then have that book work really, really well and be published really well, and have it be a completely frank discussion with, the author and the publisher about what we expect. And then I have had, I personally have not had a 7-figure offer in my career yet, but 6 figures for sure. And, and that's for fiction and or nonfiction. It really varies. I think I did see, this is one of those stats where you see, and then you can't figure out where it came from, but a lot of people had floated around, like, a lot of advances for first-time novels are like $3,000 to $5,000. Which is very different than what you would see, which is, 60,000 or 100,000. And so I think that because there is such a wide range, I think, you're looking for hopefully 5 figures on a novel, right? So, but what does that mean? Does that mean $10,000? We don't know. It really varies. And I know that's not what people want to hear. They want to hear that my book, if I go out with it, I'm going to get this much. And it's just not the case. The factors are too varied, and the business is too capricious for us to really be able to give hard numbers. And even with the profit sharing, I think someone had asked about on graphic novels. So comics and graphic novels, comic publishers sometimes operate, their business model is very different, especially if you're talking about floppy issues versus a collected trade edition. And there are some profit sharing models. There are some very small money upfront, lots of money on the back end, but that's if everybody makes money. And 50% of zero is zero. And so I always have my clients be very aware, if they're bringing one of those to me, that they know what that actually means. And for comics, you're talking about paying an artist and a writer, and the artist gets more. It's very rare that a writer would get more than the artist on a comic, because a comic takes the writer, for a 200-page graphic novel, that's at least a year and a half of their time, as opposed to a script, which is a much different thing to write. So there's so many different factors on that. And because they're so expensive to produce, that range of that is completely different. But also middle grade graphic novel at a traditional publisher is going to be treated more like a traditional book with an advance as opposed to something in a comic book company.
I think somebody had asked about picture book or children's advances. And I can comment about picture book advances, just that, again, it can be very, very small. And I think, as either Amanda or Dara mentioned before, like because of the margins involved, the overall advance is much smaller. You know, it's typically, so the total, you know, again, if there's typically an author and an illustrator, or, you know, and so, but the total advance that a publisher will want to pay on a picture book isn't going to get really above like $35,000, $40,000 unless that's pretty hot on the high end, unless there's like a significant track record or it's a really hot book sold at auction. You're going to see numbers collectively for both the author and illustrator lower than that, and typically a lot lower.
I know a lot of pre-submitted questions, and even some today, have talked about this idea of the decline of advances over time. And if it is true, which just from general conversation with authors seems that compared to what people were getting several decades ago to now, there's a difference. We were joking before how some people say, like, when I would go to my martini lunches, we're like, when I get a cup of coffee out of the Keurig when I go into my publishers. And the question being, though, what are the contributing factors for this potential decline of advances over time?
I mean, Amanda, I would love to hear your point of view from that, from in-house, because that's where the numbers are coming from. I mean, I have my theories, but it's a little different.
Yeah. So my experience is a little bit outdated from like a year ago, but I think part of it is rising costs of even just the costs of creating the book have gone up. A lot of people might not know in the audience that like in around 2018, 2019, there was a paper shortage. Just like the kind of paper that you need to make books, just it wasn't there. There are fewer printers in the US now that can print books. So all of these things kind of snowball the same way that like consumer goods are more expensive now, that extends to just creating a book. I think, you know, there's, in my experience, that's been like the biggest contributing factor. But I'm sure there are other, I'd love to hear, you know, your theories, and maybe I can kind of expand on those.
I would say even just in addition to the paper shortage, if you're having to get your paper or your printing overseas, then you have costs to get the books and the paper back to the US and then distribute it from there. So just the chain of goods and the supply chain has changed, and time in order to get all of those things together. So it is very much a back end of just making a physical book. And then it is also, you know, there's been talk about how many books are selling, and, you know, amazingly during COVID, books have been doing really well, which is great. But it can be really concentrated on a few titles. So if you look at the overall share in the market, it's oftentimes very much sort of squared on a few different titles, nonfiction and fiction, bold-faced names that people recognize no matter if they're readers or not. And so that makes the chance that a publisher is going to take on a book by an unknown writer is much riskier. And so those advances are smaller while the sure thing advances go up.
Jonathan, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree 100% with all of that. I mean, I'd say that as part of all this too, that's why we're seeing such an emphasis more and more with platform, and authors with a really strong platform, which, you know, actual real conversion, where, you know, are getting, I think their advances are, you know, they're getting paid more and more, and a lot of the money's going to them. And, you know, the riskier propositions, particularly in nonfiction, where there's an author that doesn't have a platform, they're getting less. You know, there's just so much uncertainty with all the things that Amanda and Dara mentioned, and with bookstores, and, you know, I mean, things have changed a bit, you know, for the better, at least as it relates to getting books to bookstores, and that like publishers have become much more efficient in terms of printing and shipping smaller amounts, which is a good thing. But at the same time, there's still some uncertainty around how many books Barnes & Noble is going to take. Our independent bookstores continue to on the upswing that there are now. So there's a lot of unknowns. So the sure things, I think the good bets are the ones that are getting most of the money, and the risky ones are the ones that either aren't getting offers anymore at all or getting smaller advances.
And
Yeah.
I was just going to say on the idea of platform and how it plays into the advance in especially in this sort of publishing climate, even on fiction, you're saying, you know, the author is a risk by the publisher. And basically the advance is sort of what they're willing to gamble to put that book out there. And it's not just, you know, what your social media is and what your engagement is, but do you have a following and are you engaged? Are you someone who's very comfortable in front of an audience for whatever reason? Do you, if you're a journalist, but you're writing fiction, but people follow you, are you a good literary citizen? I know that sounds very cheesy, but I really mean it. It's like if they know that you're the kind of person who's engaged in your community in a positive way, and they know that people will be so excited that you have a book out, you're going to bring some of those people, and not just your family, but like a group of people who you are in a community with, whatever that community is, that is valuable to the publisher because you're giving them sort of a built-in sales base to at least start from.
Now, I know we've been weaving in some of the questions as we go, but I do want to take these last 10 minutes to do some dedicated questions that have been coming through live. And I'll start with this idea, going back to earning out. We have used that phrase a lot throughout this conversation. And so Amanda, just starting with you, how is earning out defined? Is this based on your royalty percentage? Is it on net sales? How do we know, like, hey, I've earned out my advance?
So it is going to come out in your royalty statement, but basically every book you sell, some percentage of that initially starts going towards earning back your advance, the advance that your publisher has given you. Part of every book you sell starts going into kind of like this pool. And once you've kind of filled up to that amount that your publisher has given you, that's when you start getting royalty checks. So you will find out because you'll start getting extra money.
And it's based on, so if we talked about like the sub rights deals, so if your publisher has audio rights and, you know, foreign rights and even the ebook sales, all of those go into that same pool. And so let's say your book is modestly successful here in the US, but they sell the UK rights for a lot, 50% or 80% or whatever your, you know, agent has negotiated. Usually for translation, it's higher, it's like 75 to 80%. Will then go into your pool, your royalty pool, your royalty account. If they sell, you know, translation rights, if they don't publish their own audiobook and they sell the audiobook rights, that goes into that same pool. If they produce their own audiobook, all of those sales all go into it. So it's not just the physical sales of your book, it's every other iteration of it that the publisher controls goes into it. And so there are times when I've actually had debut authors who earn out before their book is even published due to sub-right sales. And that's lovely. It's super exciting when it happens. It usually means that the advance was on the low side, but it still means that you already have a positive publishing experience before you even had a first book.
Dara, you just brought up audio. And earlier you made a comment about audio is so difficult to get from the publisher. And that kind of lit up in the chat for a second. Why? Why is audio so difficult to get from the publisher? What does that mean?
It's one of the biggest growing formats for books right now. So in the same way that podcasts have become a huge part of the marketplace in general, just in entertainment, audiobooks have as well. And they are expensive to produce because you have to hire a really good narrator and it has to be produced well. But audiobooks are doing really well in the way that I think they thought ebooks were going to, at a certain point, I remember they were like, ebooks are going to eclipse print books. And that hasn't happened at all. They've sort of stayed steady at about a quarter of sales. But audiobooks, you know, especially for certain kinds of books, have been really, really strong. And publishers know that. And so they want to retain those rights so they get a percentage of that. Where it used to be, they didn't really care about audio and an agent would have the rights and then the agent would sell the audio rights to an audio publisher that would be separate from the book publisher. Especially at the big houses where they have their own audio production sort of divisions, they love to keep it because all of that production is in-house and they keep it all within the family and it all looks, you know, it's a very lovely way of keeping everything together. But audiobook sales are very, very high right now in a positive way. It's exciting.
I'd add to, like, there are some publishers, a couple of major publishers who, if you don't have audio rights as part of the deal, they just won't do the deal. But you know, there are ways that agents work around granting audio rights, sometimes doing the audio deal first or doing selling the audio rights concurrently. If it's a competitive situation, selling the audio rights concurrently with the print rights, and then letting audio publishers make offers and the traditional print publishers making offers that may or may not include the audio rights and trying to find the balance. It's hard though. The other thing that like agents are doing quite a bit more though of is they're saying, all right, you want these rights, pay for them. Because Derek could, I could go sell audio rights tomorrow in a second for pretty much any book. Everybody wants audio rights. And does the advance reflect that? So it's a way to at least get the advance up more. And the other thing that getting publishers to commit to is, if you want audio rights, then you need to publish it, right? It needs to be you're committing to publishing it. You're not going to license the rights, and that because a license means that a 50% decrease in the amount of royalties you're going to receive because it's a 50-50 share between the publisher and you for any sub-license. So you're making the publisher commit to publishing simultaneously with the print edition. You can ask for more things in response. Like, so yes, you have to give audio rights more almost always now, but you do have more leverage to ask more things as part of that.
So in our final minutes that we have here today, one of the early questions that rolled in is this idea of, we've been talking about traditional publishing a lot. What is the advantage of still going traditional when there are a lot of opportunities, and financially perhaps a lot of opportunities, to self-publish? So Amanda, I'm going to have you kick off with the case for why it makes sense to be a traditionally published author.
Sure. I think the biggest thing is that a traditional house has a teams and teams of people who are dedicated to working on your book. It's not just your editor. It's an art design team, the interior design team, a managing editor who makes sure everything is staying on track, people who are sourcing, the paper for your book, because if you have pictures, you want to make sure the pictures show up well on the kind of paper that you get. The cover design is a huge thing that I think a lot of people discount. Like the talent in-house at major publishers is incredible, and small publishers too. And I think then the sales and marketing team, it's, your sales team has reps dedicated to like every place that you want your book to be in: Costco, Barnes and Noble, the airport bookstores, the tiny like indie store that's down the block from you. They have like a national sales team, a lot of these houses, and then the marketing publicity teams. Your publicist has pre-existing relationships with a lot of outlets that you might not have. So I think it's just, you get this expertise and this dedicated focus that one person, it's almost impossible, I think, for one person to recreate. It's a big task to take on for yourself if you self-publish.
And I would add on that also printing and distribution, which we talked about, sourcing paper, getting the book out there. The big publishers have giant warehouses where they store your book, and they make sure that all of the indie stores and all of the big stores and all of the chains and all the online retailers and everyone has it, and everything is, self-publishing requires you to be the publisher and to do every single step that Amanda just mentioned yourself, or hire someone to do it for you. You're going to hire an editor, maybe you're going to hire a designer, maybe you're going to hire a printer, you're going to hire shipping, you're going to do all of that. And there's some people who that's what they want. They want control over the whole thing, and they want to manage the entire process. But having, been in publishing for a long time and knowing, like you said, teams and teams of people, it is a lot of people who are going in to make your book a success. And the media side is huge too. The amount of attention and marketing and publicity that a traditional publisher can get you is difficult to replicate.
Yeah, I would just add to that is that, just the amount of cost to replicate what a publisher does, unless you're a multi-talented person in all these different areas, you're most likely going to have to hire people in order to get this similar representation with self-publishing. That's a lot of money. I mean, the one thing I'd say, just as playing devil's advocate, is if you are in certain genres, like for instance, romance or SFF, where your ebook sales are 50% or more, it becomes a harder conversation because of just the difference in what you can get. Like if you're selling 60-70% in ebooks and a publisher's only paying you 25% a net, and you go directly and you can get 70% a net or 65% a net with Barnes & Noble, that's a lot of money. And so I think that's where it becomes harder. A much harder conversation rather than like a traditional nonfiction book or books in some other spaces.
Well, and I want to just briefly at the end, because I know there's still a little bit of confusion on this idea of earning out the advance. And you just mentioned the difference on net payments on royalties. So my understanding of my advance, when I earned it out, it was based on selling enough copies that it was the royalty payment that I earned off of each copy went towards the advance. So it wasn't just that I sold a net amount of the advance I was getting. It was tens of thousands more books it took me to actually earn back my advance. So I'm seeing a lot of head shaking in agreement. So I do want to clarify for folks that particularly with traditionally published authors, it's the amount that you're earning on your royalty. So maybe that's 7.5% of each book. That's what's going towards earning out the advance, not like the $15 wholesale each time your book sales, because then we'd make our advances back.
And the sub, what Dara mentioned as well, and also sub-rights deals, your share of the sub-rights deal. So like if your publisher does a $5,000 French deal, that gets split. Ideally, it's going to be 75-25 in your favor. So 75% of that $5,000 goes towards earning out your advance as well.
The easiest way for people to sort of do like a back of the napkin P&L on their own is, this is a little bit outdated, but because the numbers are easy, if you think of a hardcover being $25 and traditional hardcover royalties being 10% to start with on a traditional adult fiction book, so that's $250 a book, just to give you some easy math, right? So you have to sell how many books at getting $2.50 per each book, plus all of the sub-rights, we talked about it as well. But it basically gives you an idea of some of the math involved. So you can try to figure out like, oh, it's not that I have to sell 100 books, it's that I have to sell, 10,000 books. And that's why the, $1 million advances are incredibly hard to earn out, because if you just do the math on how many books you have to sell at a 10% or 7.5% or 6% royalty plus sub-rights to actually earn out that money, it's a lot.
And then doing the math on trying to figure out how much you're making on an ebook, depending on whether they're using an agency model or a different model, like how much, it becomes it's a lot of math.
And I want to thank you all so much for joining us. I also want to do a quick plug. We've been speaking about royalties a lot here because obviously that is integrated with the advanced conversation. We have done a webinar on understanding your royalty statement. So for those of you who receive royalty statements, please be sure to check out that webinar as well. It might help inform some of the conversation we were having here today. But thank you so much again to all of our wonderful panelists. There will be a follow-up email going out to all of you wonderful attendees and participants with more information on all of them. And I know that they were pleased to make this go on even longer. We only booked an hour of these wonderful folks' time, but I thank you so much for being here with us. Incredibly informative for me as well.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to all of our panelists. This was fantastic. So much good information and really tight. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us. Everyone, feel free to check out our videos. You can find them on authorsguild.org or on our YouTube channel. And also, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email support@authorsguild.org, and we'll be happy to help however we can. All right, well, thanks, Aaron, Dara, Amanda, Jonathan, and everyone have a good day.